You know, right now in America, most of us are more interested in, we devote more attention to, we are more influenced by secular politics than the Christian faith. Right now, a lot of us treat politics the way we used to treat religion, that political power is the conversation of the day. It is our overarching story to make sense of the world, and we almost can't help but follow it. We're all loyal to our tribes, and we somehow naturally give the government both blame and we look to it for the sort of hope that we used to look for in the stories of faith. There's lots of studies and articles to back all this up. This isn't just my opinion, but for now, just take my word that this is the opinion of a lot of people who are smarter than I am have come to. That for a lot of Americans, politics has replaced religion as what influences us and what we hope in, and it shows. Now, this isn't new. When you look at the story of the Bible, you discover that Christianity has always lived in competition with and side by side with politics and the government. And what's fascinating to me is that in the story of the Bible, Jesus just jumps in and interacts with the secular political government of his day, and we're going to talk about it. Back then, the government was way more corrupt than today, and Jesus was less afraid. There was a lot more to be scared of, and Jesus was confident. And I think by looking at this, we can learn a lot about how we reframe and focus on faith and politics, and I think we can get an ability to live without fear in the face of things that seem discouraging. Now, let me back up a second. This is part of a sermon series called The Characters of Easter. We've been telling the stories of people inside the Easter story and how Jesus affected them and how he affects us. And, let me just take a second and back up. In about 2 weeks, we're starting a brand new sermon series on Bible passages that talk about the priority of God, or the Bible term is glory. And I've been looking at some of these and just been so struck and encouraged about how big God is and thinking about how to live in the awe and reverence of the Lord. God is a bigger deal than we think he is. And we're going to talk about that. And if that sinks in, I think that will change our lives. And I'm really looking forward to this because in the next few weeks, we're going to learn how to lift up our eyes to things bigger than we are, and we're going to talk about how that gives us hope and a foundation. So that's in 2 weeks. Next week, so you know, we have a really special Sunday planned. We're going to celebrate God's call on all of us to raise up the next generation in the faith. We're going to look at that in the Bible. We have a baptism, and we're going to hear from our GEMS, which is one of our sort of amazing ministries that our church does to keep the vows that we make at baptism to help raise kids in the faith. But before we do that, today, we are talking about one of the most powerful players in the background of Easter. Today, we're going to talk about the Romans, the secular government political world that sits everywhere in the background of the Easter story. Now, let me just step outside the Easter story for a minute. The Apostle Paul, who is both a proud Roman citizen and a strict Pharisee who turned Christian, the Apostle Paul was someone who, he had an awkward relationship with the government. He got executed by Rome. But when he wrote to the Galatians, he said that Jesus' entry into the world, he uses this phrase, when the fullness of time had come. And a lot of readers have taken this to mean that Paul says that there's something about the political global atmosphere that made it the perfect time. And why was it a good time for Jesus to come? Scholars give a couple answers, and they all have to do with this sort of unique geopolitical layout of the Roman Empire. I'll give you a couple just historical details. You can look them up on your own if you want. The first really cool thing was that it was very peaceful. There were 200 years of peace, Pax Romana, if you remember the history term for it. That was a big deal. There's also international travel. The Romans they built roads throughout the empire, which made it fairly easy to travel. And what happens after the resurrection is when the disciples had to run away from Jerusalem, they were able to use roads to go further, faster, and they planted churches there. The last one, we could talk about all these for a while, was that Greek was a universal language. Alexander the Great, before Roman rule, made Greek the language of commerce all over the Roman Empire. And essentially, if you want to buy or sell things, you spoke Greek, which meant if you were Mark, Luke, John, anyone in the empire who sold things or bought things could read your letter. And of course, the Roman Empire, this isn't the entire globe, but up until that point in history, it was the most peaceful, it was the easiest to travel, and they had the best mass communication system in world history up to that point. And God sort of providentially used this empire to spread the gospel. I'll have a couple more details. The Roman government was the world's main superpower. Roman rulers were so important and elevated that they declared themselves as functional gods, which, as you can imagine, raised some issues between politics and religion when your political leader was a god. That got complicated. And the Roman government, they had I'll tell you what they did. What they did is when they took over a country, instead of erasing culture, they just added all of the religious culture to their own religion. So they would add the local god to the Roman, remember what it's called? The pantheon, the large group of gods, which was fine. It worked, except with two groups that insisted that there were only one God, the Jews and the Christians. So even saying words like, there is one God, or Jesus is Lord, was a slap in the face of a government that declared their emperor to be God. If you were a faithful Jewish person in the time of Rome, it was hard. You were surrounded by symbols of disappointment. Every time you saw a Roman soldier or a Roman flag, it was a reminder that your national identity was gone. You were no longer independent, and you were profoundly mistreated. So what you find in the Gospels and in the Easter story, that while some of the elite became very friendly with the government and they benefited from a sort of corrupt system, most people in the Easter story were upset with the government. They longed for a day when a Messiah, which is code for a new King David, would come to lead a violent revolt against the government. So some people in the Easter story likes the government, most people didn't, and if you look for that, you'll find it everywhere in the gospel stories leading up to Easter. Another reminder, and there's a bunch of these, but another thing we see showing up a lot in the Gospels is the topic of taxation. And I won't give you all the references for this, but this comes up over and over again in the Gospels behind the tax collectors and Matthew and Zacchaeus. The details behind all of the stories is that taxes were really heavy, and it took a lot from the people in Jerusalem. And to make it worse at an emotional level is that the Roman government found that it was really effective to hire Jewish citizens to collect the taxes. And because they had no friends, they would put a steep commission on top of it to just essentially rip people off. And you'll find that topic coming up a bunch of times in the Gospels. And if you don't know any of that, it's sort of, well, I'll just say knowing that helps you understand the world and the time where Jesus died, was born, and rose again. These are things that, if you were sitting around the crowds while Jesus was preaching, this is what people were talking about. People talked about the government. They had a lot of complaints. There were conspiracies. People would hope that somebody powerful would come and change things. This is everywhere in the background of the Jesus' story. In fact, that is what made Jesus so popular. Here's what happened. Jesus would do a miracle, and lots of examples of this. He would speak with authority, and the crowds, the average Jewish person only saw one benefit from somebody who had power. And the crowd said, okay, Jesus, you're powerful, you're Jewish, you're going to change the government for us. And this comes up over and over and over again, because to the surprise and disappointment of virtually everybody, every time Jesus was pushed toward being a political actor, he pushed right back. And lots of people were disappointed to the scene where, and there's this like incredible scene in the Gospel of John where he, quote, withdrew to the mountains because he perceived that the crowds wanted to, quote, take him by force to make him king. So this is what happens. Picture this for a second. There's a crowd, thousands of people, that want to elevate Jesus to be a political actor. And instead of making the nation better, Jesus, see what he did? He just sort of ran away to spend time with God. And he did that over and over again. And that got a lot of people both disappointed and upset. What really got people, it says, Jesus didn't just stay away from being a national leader. At times, he actually supported this dysfunctional, abusive Roman government. I'll give you one of many stories about this. This is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12. And he is approached by two groups, the Pharisees and the Herodians. And the topic is, should we pay taxes to this awful, corrupt government? If you remember the labels, the Pharisees were anti-government, and the Herodians were sort of the government. And both parties who had never ever talked to each other asked Jesus the same question, do we pay taxes? And it's a trap. If Jesus said, look, they're not that corrupt, pay taxes, everybody's upset with Jesus. Lots of people who detest Roman power and the creeping priority of government would be angry with Jesus if he said yes. On the other hand, if he said no, well, they'd call the cops. The Roman government would have him in trouble. It'd be a form of insurrection, the very charge that he is eventually falsely accused of. And if you follow the story, Jesus' response manages to upset everybody. Because Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar. And look at the coin, it has his picture on it. The government stamped it, that's their domain. And give to God the things which are God's, implying that that's not God. And everybody is upset with him. So on one hand, he says support the government by paying taxes. And then he tells the government, you're not as big as you think you are. That there's a God who's bigger, who deserves worship, and Caesar, the emperor, isn't sovereign over the universe. And it gets people upset because he is both telling people to obey the government, and he reminds people that the government is temporary and ultimately not in the same category of God. Now, maybe the most famous encounter Jesus has with the government is actually amazing. It's in Matthew chapter 8, and you'll find this in Luke chapter 7. There's this scene where Jesus gets approached by a Roman centurion, and he's desperate. One of the servants of this centurion has an ailment, it's paralysis, he's in so much pain, he can't move. And let me just give you a couple more details about Roman soldiers. The big one is that Jewish people hated them, and sometimes they deserved it. The Roman soldiers are the ones that would violently squash protests, often just putting to death in a really visible way critics of the government. We're talking about Roman soldiers today because in the story of Easter, their part wasn't just to arrest Jesus, but they're the ones who put the nails in the cross. Roman soldiers represent the harsh power of the state. They're the army that took over the nation of Israel. They squash any rebellion. And Luke says, really provocatively, that not every soldier is like that. Because the one we get to know the most is one who fears God. Centurion, of course, is an officer who has about 100 men in his command, and we find him on his knees before Jesus. And he's just begging Jesus, could you do a miracle? A soldier who could have ordered Jesus at sword point. He could have used his soldiers to kidnap Jesus or take a hostage of some sort. He could have just easily flashed his badge, showed off his status, but we find the centurion humbling himself and begging Jesus. And Jesus does a miracle, but that's not the headline for me. He does something outrageous and offensive. Jesus elevates this Roman centurion, hated by every faithful Jew, as a faithful person. And I'm just going to read the text. Jesus says, "I have not found so great of a faith anywhere in Israel." You ever think about how humiliating and upsetting that must have been for his audience? Jesus goes, I've been in Israel. I've talked to a lot of Jewish people. I've got disciples. I've talked to a lot of religious leaders. But if I had to give out a trophy for the person who has the most faith, I'd give it to the centurion. I'm thinking like poor John the Baptist. Like, remember me, cuz? And Jesus goes, this Roman centurion who everybody hates, one of the soldiers who would crucify Jesus, one of those guys. Jesus says, you have the greatest faith in all of Israel. That is provocative and would have been offensive. And it teaches us that God finds goodness and faith where no one else expects to find it. Which tells us that the people that we've all been trained to hate and despise, there may be human hearts that we can't see, that God can, with more faith and goodness than people who think that they're close to God. In fact, Jesus' own disciples showed this off. There's 12 disciples, and they are incredibly politically polarized. They would not have showed up at the same marches. They would not have voted the same way. If you just look at the name tags they wore, you have a zealot. You know what a zealot is? A zealot was someone who, essentially a domestic terrorist. You've got Simon the zealot. And then you've got Matthew the tax collector. This guy would have gotten bombed by the domestic terrorists, and they're in the same room together, and just incredibly hard to imagine people that polarized and opposed uniting as followers of Christ. I think the Easter story, the gathering of disciples, tells us that there's room for more people than you think. Now, to be clear, the death of Christ, this was in God's control. It wasn't as though the Romans forced God to do something, but the government was really involved, obviously. If you read the story, the governor puts him on the cross. These soldiers arrested Jesus. They beat Jesus. And I just want to show you two different scenes from this that tell the story of what the government did in the life of Jesus. Now, this cross is a Roman symbol. The Greeks and Romans conquered the whole known world, and they got really, really good at killing people. And for many of the soldiers, this was just another day at their office. What do you do for a living? Well, I execute people to keep peace. You'll find this story, they're just sitting around playing, tossing dice, gambling for Jesus' garments. You find Matthew 27, they're mocking Jesus, "Hail, King of the Jews." And as Jesus was on the cross, you find him interacting with these folks with forgiveness. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." Jesus on the cross is busy forgiving people. In fact, that's what we celebrate in communion. That all of us are laden with sins that we choose, and even sins that we commit without knowing what we're doing. That the human heart is often blind to how we offend God and hurt each other. And yet at the cross, we find Jesus forgiving people like us because of the death of the innocent. And of course, not all the soldiers mocked. One soldier, another centurion, looks up from Jesus in verse 54 of Matthew 27. I think you have this in your handout. And he declares, "Truly this man was the Son of God." We don't know what he means by that. We don't know where he went next. Was he trusting Christ? Was he acknowledging after the ground split open and the sky turned dark that there's something unique about this crucifixion? We don't know where his heart is. But we do know that not every executioner had a hard heart. In this story, days later, as the soldiers guarded the sealed tomb where he lay, we find another set of soldiers. And they are confronted with the resurrected Lord. They get knocked flat on their backs and they faint as Jesus on Easter morning shook off the shackles of death and rose from the grave. I'm just going to read this from Matthew 28. There was a violent earthquake because an angel of the Lord had descended from heaven and approached the tomb. He rolled back the stone and was sitting on it. His appearance was like lightning. His clothing was as white as snow. And the guards, I love this part, the guards, the entire empire cowered in fear of these guards. The guards were so shaken by fear of really just one angel that they became like dead men. You've got to imagine those soldiers. They, in the story, they get bribed by the religious leaders not to tell anybody about this fact. But how could they keep a promise like that indefinitely? That's the story of the executioners that we find in the Easter story. The secular government, power that lurked everywhere, fainting in fear when they see the power of God. Now the question I just want to tease a little bit is this: what do we do with that dimension of this story? And what might God say to us, Americans, like those Jewish folks who we tend to be constantly thinking about political power and secular government, how it's broken, what to fix? Let me try and maybe humbly try and answer that question. And I'm going to say humbly because I'm really cautious as a historian making any real analogy between the Roman Empire in Palestine and the U.S. political system. I'm not a social studies teacher. I don't really understand everything. I will say, though, there's a lot of big differences. Like, the Roman government seems a lot worse. We have it really, really good, I think, in comparison. The Roman government doesn't claim to be God, just objectively on the basis of things like morality, human rights, freedom, even freedom of speech. Like, it's just really hard to make good analogies because it's so much better today, I think. I will add, actually, while in the Roman Empire, back then the Roman emperor spoke and everybody else listened, we have a lot more of a shared responsibility. Like, we actually should think about this stuff because people are more than crowds. You are voters, and you have, I think, have a responsibility to make good decisions. So with all those like weird caveats, I'm really cautious to make comparisons between Jewish people in the Roman Empire and Americans discussing Washington, so to speak. So I'm just going to make some sort of cautious applications, I think, just as suggestions. For me, the big picture is that Jesus simultaneously follows the law, like he honors the government, and he simultaneously is able to put the government in his own sort of box. Government is a temporary structure for now, dealing with much smaller issues than faith and the kingdom of heaven. And I think if you look at how Jesus acts, there's this idea just as strong in the background that when you see how big God is, when you see God's love and his power, like that is a bigger deal than politics, and it ought to unite people in faith. So in the church, in Jesus' disciples down to the 12, I mean, you have incredibly polarized people. Simon the Zealot, Again, like imagine a anti-IRS domestic terrorist with like bomb plans in this briefcase who's sitting next to Matthew, the tax collector, the IRS agent, and you go, how are you guys in the same room here? But they're both part of Christ's close followers. And I don't know if they ever agreed with each other on anything else other than faith, but God brings them together somehow. And I'm not really sure what they thought about the government matters, because what we find out is that faith is so much bigger than politics that it should allow people who are polarized to come together in Christian, I'll use the idea of communion because that's what we're celebrating. And that's a major lesson from this story. I think for me, though, maybe the biggest lesson comes from how Jesus thinks about the power of this incredibly corrupt, messed up government system. And I have the story in your handout. Let me just tell you the story of Jesus' interaction with the government. So it's the Last Supper, it's a final meal, communion, which we'll celebrate in a few minutes. We're supposed to remember the meal we're about to talk about. And as soon as that meal is done, Judas goes to get the government to arrest Jesus. And Jesus leaves the scene. So I imagine Judas is bringing the government back to the supper, and Jesus goes to the garden where, if you remember, they pray and they fall asleep. And the text says the government shows up, the police come with loud weapons and lights, just as disruptive of sirens and lights. And there's this line, Jesus is in the garden, but he, quote, knows all that is about to happen. And what would you do if that was you? I'll tell you what I would do. If I knew what was about to happen, and if I knew that the trial was rigged and the government was corrupt, I'd be afraid. I would probably stay in the garden in those trees. You see what Jesus does? He does the craziest thing. Jesus, it says, he goes out. In other words, he's in the shadows in the garden. It's late at night. He hears the officers and he flags them down. Like, hey guys, he says, who is it that you want? And the story goes, the soldiers respond, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Obviously, having no idea who he's talking to. And Jesus, if it were me, I'd go, so you don't know who I am. I'm going to go pray for a while. Good luck. Or you're looking for Jesus. I would go, you should look that way. But Jesus says something that turned out to be fatal. He says, I am he. Hint of divinity, the I am. And see what the government does? They fall down in shock. They don't know what to do with Jesus, because in a scenario where everybody else would have been afraid, Jesus is confident, unafraid of what might happen even when it is the worst possible scenario. And this scene is a microcosm of the story of Easter. This clash between the power of heaven, the world of faith, and the world of politics and the government. The carpenter's son has more strength in his words than the world's mightiest army, wielded with all this weaponry. What a powerful scene. I think for me, the biggest thing I learn about how Jesus thinks about politics is his sense of fearlessness. That's not how we normally act, right? We get consumed by it. We become fearful and afraid. Jesus puts the government in its own box, and he's unafraid. It's what Paul writes as a prisoner to a corrupt, dysfunctional government in 2 Timothy 1:7. For God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and of love and of self-control. And I think just me reading this story, what I get from the story of Jesus and his executioners is that when you have faith, when you see how big God is, you're able to simultaneously act as a responsible citizen, and you're able to put God first, and you're able to be unafraid of what people can do to you. And I think if we could follow Jesus' example It might change a lot about how we think about things. It might change a lot about the confidence that we have to do what God's called us to do without fear. So, Father in heaven, as we approach the Lord's table, can you remind us of how much we need you, and that we can trust you, and that you are bigger than whatever else we happen to be afraid of? Can you remind us of our need for you, and can you give us the confidence that comes from seeing how big you are? I ask all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.